got a good place to start. I know there's some more of you that'll be signing in and probably grabbing your lunch as well. But I'll say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from today, if any of you dial in anymore. I don't know why we still say that. But my name is Frank Chistalkian with the Medical Alley Association. And I'm so pleased that you're joining us today for another AMA Ask Me Anything, where we bring on creative entrepreneurs, investors, corporate leaders from the Medical Alley community to share their story, share their journey, but more importantly, give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask questions of people who have been there, done that. That as you're on your entrepreneurial journey, you might be able to learn from them, gain new perspective from them, and hopefully make your work a little bit easier because of the hard work that they've done. This is part of our Medical Alley Starts initiative, our work to lower the cost, to start, scale, and pivot new ventures right here in Medical Alley. And as part of this event, we're joined by a couple of our sponsors, organizations who help us fund the work that we're doing, make it possible to do this great work, and also do incredible work in the ecosystem, supporting many of your companies. And I always ask, support the sponsors, the companies that help your community do better. They're also businesses. Make sure you learn about them, connect with them, help them grow their businesses, and keep the cycle going. So I'm going to ask each of them just to say a few words, introduce their organization, and then we'll jump into the program. And to start with that, I'm going to ask Mike Giedel from JP Morgan if he'd say a few words. Mike, please.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Giedel. I am with JP Morgan, and I run our healthcare and life sciences business across the Midwest, the Intermountain, and Canadian ecosystems. You may think of JP Morgan as a big bank that will only take you public or sell your business at the end of the day, but that is the furthest thing from the truth. My team works with companies that are starting at inception, all the way through companies with several $1 billion of firm value. And so what we bring to the table is really a suite of products and solutions that can help your company become more efficient as it relates to your payables processes, your credit card needs, as well as networking opportunities to help within our own network to help you find potential venture capital opportunities, as well as bring you to the next level within your life cycle with our different products and services. So we are a very proud sponsor of Medical Alley Starts. We have been part of Medical Alley for the last several years. We have enjoyed every piece of it. We're looking forward to meeting as many of you folks as possible. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll turn it back over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Mike. And I got to echo what he said. They really do great work, even down to the earliest of stage companies, which not a lot of banks can do. I think it's a big credit to Mike and his team for how much they've committed and invested in this community. You guys should seek them out. And you've got a banking relationship. You then got to make sure that your credits and debits add up right and you're doing good work. And there's a wonderful organization that can help with that, with our friends at CLA, who also can do so much more. So, Paul, I might ask you to just say a few words as well.
Thank you, Frank, and it is also great to be here today. CLA, we're a professional services firm that provides a whole suite of services ranging from traditional accounting and tax to outsourcing, wealth advisory, and consulting services. And we do this through providing industry-focused services to our clients, and our healthcare industry group and life science industry groups help to allow entrepreneurs to focus on their business and help reduce the cost to start and scale that business. We're very excited to team up with Medical Alley Starts program, and providing a discount of 25% for the first year of our working relationship, so that we can help the entrepreneurs and the business owners focus on defining, articulating, and growing the future that they envision for their company. So it's great to be here, Frank, and we look forward to it.
Paul, thank you. And folks, I think you get when we say we want to lower your costs to start, scale, and pivot, We mean that in all ways, and sometimes it means in the most straightforward of ways of saving you money on services. You've got all that put together, and if you're dealing in healthcare, your IT systems are going to be incredibly important. And so I feel very fortunate that we have a great partner and a couple of gurus who does incredible work, are entrepreneurs themselves. And so, Joshua, I'll ask you to say the last words from our sponsor community.
All right, saving the best for last. Thank you, Frank. By the way, if you haven't met Frank yet, he has got the coolest red shoes, like super cool. So, I don't know if you wear those shoes all the time, Frank, but seriously cool. But yes, I'm Joshua Davis. I work for a couple of gurus. Key Schoolcraft started it back in 2002, and we are an IT services firm. We do things like day-to-day technology support, but we also are really big, especially in the startup and regulated spaces with, compliance and regulations. Technology planning is really huge as well. So pretty much anything that you would need from an IT perspective, we could pretty much do it all. One last thing I would like to leave you with is just kind of a something to think about here. So research shows that the fastest way to joy and happiness is gratitude and establishing a habit of being thankful. So just something really great to think on, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. And I am grateful and appreciative of you and your support and this whole group's support. Folks, we're going to transition now to the program itself. You'll see on your screen a Q&A function. Throughout this, anytime, if you've got a question of Sean as we're going through, please ask the question. Just put it in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring those. I'll pull it up. I'll incorporate it into the conversation. If you don't see it right away, that's because maybe we're having a good discussion and I want to incorporate it at the right spot. So yeah, anytime, throw those questions in the Q&A. And with that, we'll get started. And first thing I'll do is, Sean, I'll ask you to maybe just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you've been up to.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. So again, I'm Sean Benson. I've been in the healthcare information technology space for about 28 years. I started back in the mid-90s at a company called ProVation Medical. I co-founded that in 1994. ProVation Medical's real focus is on creating tools that physicians use to document their procedures. That was kind of the initial concept back in the mid-90s. And to this day, that's what they're still doing. ProVation has 5,000 customers around the world. It's international. It was acquired by another organization named Wolters Kluwer back in about 2006. Wolters Kluwer, or WK, is a global company that is in a lot of different verticals, including healthcare. So after the acquisition, I stayed with WK for a number of years. I ran their internal incubator called the Innovation Lab. We focused on creating a lot of different startup products. It was like a startup within the larger company. One of which, probably the most notable, is a product called POC Advisor, which was a surveillance tool that looks for patients declining in the hospital, looking for certain things like sepsis and early warning signs around that. And it was an alerting system that would send alerts to the point of care. We did a lot of work in that area. And then I left WK about 4 years ago to start Juniper Health.
And before we talk about Juniper, I'm just curious, what was it like starting a digital health company in '94, maybe compared to like what you're doing today? Or did we even call it digital health then? Was that health IT or something then?
Yeah, we didn't call it digital health, that's for sure. And I think we called it health IT pretty early on. You mentioned dial-up, and we I kind of laughed thinking back to those old days. We definitely used dial-up, kind of dialing in to connect to these different centers. It was, it was different than it is now, to be sure, but actually we were in a pretty good spot because back then in the early 90s, a lot of things had become much more affordable for a startup. I remember thinking back in 94, 95, that we were lucky that we could launch this startup with, $10,000, $20,000 because a computer could be purchased for $1,000. And we were laughing because well, if this was the 80s, we'd have to spend $100,000 just to get the right equipment to get this going. So it was early days, but things were getting much less expensive, and it was becoming much easier for, kind of quote unquote, two guys in a room to build a company, which is what essentially we were.
Oh, very cool. And yeah, that trend of the declining cost of computers and computing seems to have been just a revolution for startups in general, but particularly in this space.
Yeah, that was a huge change. I mean, you went from needing kind of an army of people and a huge amount of money to truly just a couple people that were able to really kind of dive into a problem could take on the biggest companies and succeed. So back with ProVation, at least, our biggest competitors when we started were Olympus and Pentax, the big Japanese camera companies.
Oh, wow.
And because they were really big in the field of gastroenterology because they made the scopes that were used during the procedures. And so, on paper, it looked like a really unfair fight. We're going against these behemoths, but in reality, it was unfair in the reverse because we had the tools and everything we needed to run circles around these big companies. And so that was a real advantage for us.
I like that reframing a lot, that, yeah, because of the technology changes, because of the nimbleness, you had certain advantages that a large company wouldn't, and it's not as, one-sided as it might seem.
Absolutely.
If we jump ahead a bit, all right, so now you're working on a company called Juniper Health. What I really want to ask is how you got to this point, but let's start with, what is Juniper Health? What are you doing today?
Yeah, so hospitals have to submit data to clinical registries. For example, there's a national trauma database and a national cancer database. And so if you're a patient and you have cancer, the hospital that's taking care of you has to submit a lot of data about your care. And it's hundreds of data elements. And the way that hospitals do this is they employ small armies of people who spend their days just reading through the chart, manually reading from top to bottom every single document in the chart, looking for all the different information that's relevant to your case. And then they manually type in the answers into these trauma registry submission software packages that then submit the data to these centralized repositories. And so, so the whole process is manual, highly variable in quality, as you can imagine. And what we do is we apply automation to that process. So we take the data out of the electronic health record, bring it up into the cloud. We use different kinds of technologies like natural language processing to structure the information. And we have a rules-based system that then takes all that newly structured information and we automatically fill in and answer all of the questions that apply to that particular registry, and then we submit the data. And so the benefits, as you can imagine, are an incredible amount of time savings. We can take a team of registrars and make them 3 or 4 times more productive. So it saves the hospital a lot of money, and they're delivering much higher quality data.
And I have to imagine that if they're doing that much work today, putting that much labor into it, submitting the data to the registries, it must be valuable to the hospitals.
Yeah, in some cases they have to do it. So for example, for cancer, it's a compliance issue. They're legally required to do it.
Interesting.
For trauma centers, it's very similar. You'll drive by a hospital like Hennepin County Medical Center and it'll say level 1 trauma center. Well, to keep those designations and to be designated as a trauma center, they really have to submit this data to this trauma registry. So hospitals, in many ways, with some of these bigger registries, essentially have to do it. And then for other registries, it becomes more optional, but for the really big ones, they're essentially mandatory.
Oh, interesting. And you mentioned in there in your previous comment, natural language processing and rules-based systems. I didn't hear AI in there necessarily. Can you talk about the technology that you're putting into this and maybe some of the choices you've had to make about what you use or don't use?
Yeah. And so, AI, I think it's always important to define what it is you're talking about. So people say AI a lot and they use it kind of interchangeably to mean a number of different things. At least the way that I think about it, I would call what I think when you say AI, I almost think of that as machine learning. So there's the machine learning approach, which is basically you find a whole bunch of data to build a machine learning model. And so you take this data as kind of your inputs, you use machine learning to create the model, and then you use that model to apply on future data coming into your system to then give recommendations and give advice and automate processes. So that's an approach that we're not using. So machine learning AI is a very hot term these days. And I think it's useful in certain really specific use cases, but I don't think it's the right fit for a lot of other scenarios. Our approach instead is we use a rules-based system, which is kind of the old-fashioned, in quotes, if-then. If this patient has this condition and they're this age, then do these things. And at least for our use case, we feel as though it's a much better approach because we're able to have very, very specific pathways for all the different scenarios. If you're using machine learning, your model is only as good as the data that you're feeding into the machine. And if your data is not really clean and well verified and qualified, you'll end up with bad recommendations kind of coming out of the system. The other big problem I see with machine learning, at least for what we're doing, is that it's a black box. And so the machine can give you advice on something and say, we think you should answer yes to this question that the patient has this particular condition, but it can't really provide the rationale for why the machine is making that recommendation. Whereas with a rules-based system like ours, we can say exactly why we recommend a certain thing, and we can even provide underlying support from the chart that says, this is why we're recommending this. We found this passage in the chart here, and we found this mention over here, and we found this billing code over here, and we can put all that right in front of the person so they can make up their own mind.
Oh, interesting. And I gotta say, as you're describing all of this, I realize healthcare being a $4 trillion industry, it is giant niche on top of giant niche and a lot of esoteric things. So I'm just curious, how did you come across, this as an opportunity, this is a need, and go about validating, hey, there might be an actual business here?
Yeah, so before I left WK, I knew that I was going to start another company at some point. And before I landed in this area of registry automation, I started to write down just the characteristics of what the business would do that I would start, even though I didn't know exactly what we were going to focus on. I started to think in terms of what should this business focus on? I knew it would be healthcare. I knew it would be health systems as opposed to the payer side, because my focus has been much more on the health system side. I wanted to identify a process within the hospital that people were currently doing today, spending money on a current process, so a real problem, real money going out the door, on a process that was inefficient, but that nobody liked and nobody defended. And that's really important, because there are all kinds of inefficient processes in hospitals. But if an important constituent likes it that way, like if the doctors don't want to change, it doesn't mean that it's impossible to change, but it's going to be really difficult. So I wanted to find something that nobody liked, nobody defended, and I wanted to make sure that the solution was something that employed automation. It had to be hard to do. It couldn't just be something that any old company could pull 10 people together and build something. It had to be really complicated, and it had to be something that I and the founding team were uniquely qualified to go after. So that was kind of the framework that I was using as I was thinking about this, not really even knowing what we were going to do. And as I started to come across different concepts and ideas and opportunities, I would kind of run it through that filter to say, well, does it apply here or not? There was one idea, I'll give you one example. Physician credentialing came up a lot.
Oh,
in my research. Big problem, all kinds of problems, very inefficient, et cetera. But the more I looked at it, I just thought, this feels like something that anybody could do, not to give it short shrift, but it seems like I could see the solution. I could see 100 other people coming up with a solution. So I thought this seems like something that could be in danger of being a commodity. And interestingly now, when I check the press releases of the last year or so, I see a lot of companies popping up to do credentialing, which is not surprising. And I'm glad we didn't go down that road. And so I started to gravitate more towards this area of registry automation. And the more that I dug into it, the more that it really fit in that model. I knew that hospitals were spending money on it today. It was inefficient. Nobody really liked the process, not even the abstractors doing the work. I knew the solution was going to be incredibly complicated. So no one could just kind of throw a team together and do this. And we had a lot of experience building systems like this that apply automation to clinical data. And so I thought this is the kind of like right at the right fit. And it's also importantly for us, at least, is that it's not a back office process like a lot of the rev cycle management work that's being done, but it's also not a point of care solution. So it's not something being used by physicians in real time. It's almost this middle ground where you have people that have clinical training that are doing this work. So it's highly clinical work. It's not back office, but it's not point of care. It's not doctors using it in the heat of the battle. It's more these people kind of in between. And so it just kind of felt like we were just threading the needle on just the right fit, at least for what our experience was.
Right on. And I appreciate you sharing that like whole approach of you guys had kind of a filter up front of what you would look for, what could make sense, and then went through and evaluated different ideas, different opportunities. As you've done that, what's the reception been like so far, right? Like I think about you set up a process, have you got the outcome, at least so far, that you've hoped as a result?
Yeah, so, I kind of created that framework. This was now 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought instead of just kind of jumping in, pretty quickly I established that I was going to focus on registries, but I thought I really want to do a deep dive and spend a lot of time kind of understanding the opportunity. How big is the problem? Is it really as big of a problem as I think? Is there an opportunity here? If we create a solution, is there enough value being delivered? And so I spent about 18 months essentially doing research with health systems, going to different health systems, both within the Twin Cities and elsewhere. And I started at, kind of the highest echelons of the organization that I could find, meeting with, CEOs or board members or CFOs, pitching the basic idea, but also presenting it as, this is kind of a research project. And do I have permission to conduct research within your organization to determine if there's enough value here? And maybe there won't be. And if there isn't, then, I'll kind of move on. But I also said, if there is, I'm probably going to launch a company around this, and we're going to build a product. And if so, would you be interested in being an early adopter of a product like this? So I wanted to kind of qualify them as potential early adopters, but I also truly wanted to kind of dig into the organizations to figure out, is there a real opportunity there or not?
Oh, very interesting. And this clearly, wasn't your first rodeo or your first time around. When you think back to like the start of ProVation and the work you did in between, did your approach change? I imagine you learned things along the way, but how different was doing this startup in that respect compared to, say, starting ProVation?
Totally different.
Yeah.
Completely. It was like night and day. I mean, ProVation, we started, I was, 26 years old, and I just didn't want to work in a big company. That was kind of my motivating factor. And I just, met a friend through some other friends who was thinking about starting a company. He had no idea what he was going to do specifically. And we just met up with a physician who was trying to work on a tool like this for physicians to generate procedure documentation. And we just said, hey, this is kind of interesting. Let's just build this. And, we didn't do any market research. We didn't interview anybody. We didn't calculate the total addressable market. We didn't understand the competition. We didn't know the value prop. We didn't know what the benefits would be. We didn't know how the software would work. We didn't know how we were going to build it, but other than that, we had everything figured out. So it was basically, we just had, we were highly motivated, but we didn't have answers to really anything. And we just kind of answered it as we went along. And we were, it was a combination of some luck and some hard work and everything else, but things kind of fell together the right way. But that's how we did it. Whereas with Juniper, I almost approached it as, like I said, like a research project. I thought, well, I've got to research this to figure out if it's worth spending time on, because if I'm going to do it, I know I'm going to spend, 5-10 years working on this thing. And I want to make sure I'm going in with as much information as I possibly can. And that's why I really focused on conducting the research to establish what's the benefit, what's the value proposition, what's the elevator pitch, what's it going to take to build the product, what will the product look like, will they use it, who's the competition, How big of an IT lift will this be to implement? Kind of all these important questions that are just critical questions that I wanted to really get my arms around before I went out and decided to launch the company.
Oh, interesting. I mean, it's a good sign of like there are many ways to get to a similar place. The role of luck and hard work, so big. And then thinking about like the world as we know it today in healthcare, where there are so many ventures coming forward, there are so many new companies popping up. I appreciate you sharing like both of those approaches, like how you've approached developing the companies. One of the things we get asked a lot about startups in general, and listeners, I'll remind you, if you got any questions anytime, you go ahead and throw them in. You do not have to wait. We get asked a lot about the financing side of things, right? People see the stories of the big, huge venture-backed financings in public stories. And then sometimes they see the companies blow up. Sometimes they see them have massive exits, but we tend to only see the extremes of it. So I'd be curious, relative to what you're doing now, how have you approached financing the company? Do you see this as like a venture backable path, as a different path, maybe TBD? Really, what's your thought process there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I learned a lot with ProVation. The route that we took at ProVation was, it was essentially kind of bootstrapped in the early years, and then we very quickly raised a pretty decent amount of money in the kind of the middle years. Maybe it's like $30 plus million back in the late 90s. And I think at the time it was kind of the big internet era, and there was a big push to kind of get big fast and get eyeballs, and there wasn't a big focus. Yeah, exactly. And there wasn't a big focus on profitability or cash flow positivity or anything like that. And, it was a learning experience because we ended up almost always with our backs against the wall financially. Almost always, perpetually, we were kind of in danger of running out of money. And I just really didn't like being in that position. And so when I launched Juniper, before I started, I thought, I don't want to put us in the position where we're desperate for cash, which makes us do desperate things. And I also wanted to be a real defender of the cap table, because I see so many companies have their shares, their equity diluted so much because they end up having to raise a lot of money. And it happened at ProVation. I just thought, I'm going to defend the cap table if it's the last thing I do, and be really careful about how we mete out the equity. And so to that end, the approach I've taken thus far is I raised an early kind of a seed round right when COVID started. It was, the research was kind of winding down, and I was becoming more and more convinced that we should launch the company. I'd been talking to a number of colleagues of mine, kind of preparing them to say, hey, I'm going to be coming to you as an investor here pretty soon, just kind of get ready. And it was right in March of 2020, right when COVID was coming together, I thought, this is ironically going to be a good time to launch a company, because we need a good year or two underground, so to speak, to build the product. And health systems are not going to be available to do anything for the foreseeable future anyway. And so I raised the first round in March of 2020. And then we raised another seed round earlier this year. And again, we were fortunate with the timing because it was before the stock market started to really go down. And so my opinion on funding at this point is, I've just wanted to raise seed capital from angel investors, but I also want to have a long runway. So now where we are is we have years of cash in the bank. So a very long runway. I'm not anticipating raising any money for quite some time. And if and when we ever do again, I want to do it from a position of great strength where we're cash flow positive, so we can help to kind of control the terms, as opposed to having the terms being dictated to us. So that's kind of my view on it at this point.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize something you said in there with ProVation. You talked about raising $30 million, which even today is a decent chunk of change, and constantly being on the hunt for cash, and the being short meaning having to be desperate, which I imagine gives the investors that ability to leverage what you're doing and get terms favorable maybe to them, but not to the founders, right? Like almost paradoxical of so a lot of cash and being short, whereas today it sounds like you've been more, not cautious, but more thoughtful about it, keeping your cost structure low so that you have that long runway. Um, without going into specifics of it, could you maybe just illuminate for founders the risks that they take when they do go out and pursue venture rounds or get large outside capital? What starts to happen to the cap table, to their position in the company over time? And not to say venture capital is bad, but that they should know, hey, here's what you're getting into and what sort of decisions you have to make.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think, people should know what they're getting into. First of all, most obviously, you're going to have a smaller equity position in your company because you have to give up equity to bring that money in. And oftentimes what happens is the outside investors end up, potentially controlling more of your company than you do. And that's when, the tables start to turn and they start to make decisions for you. You're no longer in a position to make certain key decisions. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when you receive that money, there are expectations that come with that in terms of what the return is going to be and in what time frame. And so all of a sudden now you have to start operating under different expectations and a different time frame for when the market's going to start to go. So an outside investor may really press you to do something aggressive in the marketplace, and the marketplace may not be ready, but you have to do it anyway. So that's one thing that I've been really careful about, is that in healthcare, for example, healthcare IT, the market almost never moves quickly. I've almost never seen it move quickly for anything ever. And so going in with that mindset, it's not like I have low expectations around that, but I understand that it's going to take a long time for this market to develop. And sometimes with an outside investor, if they don't appreciate that, they may be applying a lot of pressure on the team to move more quickly when you're essentially pushing a rope and you're saying, well, I can spend this money on a sales team, but it's going to be, we might as well flush it down the drain for what it's worth. So I think, you end up having different masters, you end up having to do things that maybe aren't the best thing for the business, and you lose more of your equity. So to me, my bias is to be very careful about raising money and really know what you're getting into before you do it.
Yeah, well said. And I appreciate you making the point about, the speed or lack thereof that exists in healthcare. That, yeah, hospitals, payers, even patients, right, move on their own terms. And putting more capital, putting more fuel on the fire is unlikely to make them move faster for you.
That's right. They're going to say, that's great, you want to get this deal, but we're not interested in moving on your time frame. We're going to move when we're ready. And I think that's something that's really important when you're identifying an opportunity, is that you really want to find something. And I mentioned this earlier, kind of with the framework, is that you want to identify a problem that the hospital has right now. And hopefully it's a problem that they will have in the future. It's not just an in the moment problem that will go away. Because if the problem isn't happening right now, I think it's very difficult to get a health system interested in something that will be potentially good 3 years down the road when the payment models totally change. I mean, I would urge people not to get into that, because I would try to avoid trying to figure out where the puck is going to be. I would look at where the puck is right now and say, okay, is this puck, is this still going to be a relevant thing in the future? And is it important now? Then at least it's a candidate to do some work on it. I would avoid trying to do things that are kind of speculative, because I just don't think the market can bear that.
Well, and this, I think, this is a good point to bring in one of the first questions to come from the audience. And I'll paraphrase it a bit. Mark, thanks for your question, putting it in there. But Mark is asking about your perspective or your opinion on the synthesis of clinician tools and patient tools. And I might ask it as, given the work you've done, the experiences you've had, do you see those things as a puck where it is today, or maybe that's where the puck is going to be someday in the future, TBD? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it depends upon what the use case is. So for example, ProVation is a physician tool. And we, started building that product in 1994. And if you were to look at what ProVation's doing today, they're doing a few different things, but fundamentally, it's still what they're doing. And so the
Yeah.
bullseye hasn't moved in 28 years in a good way. You know, what we thought was going to be valuable back in the 90s is still valuable. And so I think you want to just find, and the same goes for patients, although patients are even more difficult because they're harder to really predict. I think you want to identify something that can be embraced by those end users in a positive way. Like with ProVation in general, the doctors embraced the tool because it was a productivity tool that made their lives better and they could get things done more quickly and they had kind of an obvious payout from it. If you're talking about a tool that isn't obvious to the provider or to the patient, because it's something that's in the future or speculative, or it's kind of a nice to have, or it's a little thing around the edges, or it's icing on the cake, then I would just get ready to be disappointed, because I think the user, whether they're a physician or a patient, are just going to look at it and say, this isn't compelling enough for me. This isn't important enough. So for example, there's a lot of talk around decision support tools at the point of care and delivering alerts to providers at the point of care, because it'll help them with better clinical decision making and all that. I think that's great, but I think it is very fraught and very dangerous territory. And I say this from personal experience because we built that sepsis alerting tool about 6-7 years ago when I was at Wolters Kluwer. Everybody thought it was great. Everybody said, yes, sepsis is a huge problem and early detection is a huge challenge, and et cetera, et cetera. And we were able to get it up and running at a beta site and we had good results. But we took it to the marketplace and we realized that, for one thing, doctors are being deluged with alerts and they have alert fatigue, and they can't tell the difference between your alert, which might be a good alert, and every other alert they're getting all day. And they just end up ignoring half of them anyway. So right there, we're like, oh, whoops, this alert isn't even getting to the right person. Or even more basic things like, we assumed there'd be a cohesive mobile device strategy with these healthcare systems. And at the time, there was nothing. There was almost nothing. So it's like, oh, wow, we miscalculated there too. So we had all these assumptions and these things that we thought would work. And as we got it out into the field, we realized like, wow, we've made like 50% of our assumptions are just not correct. And it's going to really impact our ability to be successful in this space. I mean, so when people even today talk about alerting at the point of care, I just get a red flag. I just think danger zone. This is going to be tricky territory.
Oh yeah. And that actually flows right into the next question, which came in from Whitney. She's asking about passion and the role of passion as being an entrepreneur and sustaining yourself through the long journeys. She's particularly wondering about, do you find your passion in the problem that's being addressed, the solution you bring forth, or maybe it's a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think it's both. I get excited about both. I mean, I love being in startups. This is definitely kind of the world that I should be in. And I love finding a problem that's a big problem for hospitals and coming up with a solution that makes their lives better and makes their teams more efficient is just thrilling to me. I mean, even to this day, just thinking about ProVation's out there chugging along with hundreds of employees and 5,000 hospitals using the product, and they were just reacquired last year for $1.4 billion. So ProVation is now a unicorn. I mean, that to me is just super exciting because it's like, wow, this is great. There's this thing that I helped create that is still out there delivering value to customers and having an impact on the employees' lives, on customers' lives. And so I just get excited about all of it.
Right on. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that about ProVation. That was awesome news to see when they got reacquired. Great validation of the incredible work that was done and of this community helping to build up new innovations, which is something you've been involved in, not just in your individual work as an entrepreneur, but as part of the broader community. So I'm curious, as you've gone about, you're building companies, where do you go when you need help, or how do you get advice, to try and solve some of the problems that maybe you haven't confronted before?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the industry now for almost 30 years. And so over that time, I've developed a lot of good relationships with people who are just, really good in different parts of healthcare information technology, whether it's from a product perspective or marketing or sales or investors. And so I've got a pretty good network of people that I can go to get advice or just bounce ideas off. I mean, the founding team at Juniper is fantastic. These are a couple of people that I've been working with on and off for many, many years. These are like the experts in their field. So that's a great resource. My colleagues from ProVation have been great resources. The investors are really good. So it's a pretty wide network of people that are out there that I can tap into. And one thing that I just, before the previous question, something other thing that I wanted to mention just for the audience, if you're thinking about starting a company in a specific niche, you may be surprised by how much value could be in what's ostensibly kind of a niche area. And I use ProVation as exhibit A. So we started that company, and to this day, its core focus is gastroenterology procedure documentation. And it does other things and it's what have you, but that's its core focus. And the company has become the expert in that area and has become the de facto standard. And just in that area, GI procedure documentation, they've been able to unlock enough value to create a unicorn. And so I would say if you become, pick a niche area, but become the expert's expert in that area, and I think you'll find a lot of hidden value.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That is well said. We often think about, the big giant markets, cardiovascular disease or metabolic disorders or health insurance. And yes, big markets can be big businesses, but healthcare is $4 trillion in the US. Even a small market is probably pretty darn big once you look at the whole of the country. So yeah, niches can be riches.
Yep, exactly.
I might turn around as we come in towards the end. My last question for you, and audience members, keep them coming. My last question would be, as you've interacted with other entrepreneurs over the years, what are some of the most common things, you hear as challenges they're facing? What advice might you give them, to the entrepreneurs who are out here? What would you, if they were to ask you for help, what do you think they're asking you about that they're needing help with?
Yeah, I think it really depends upon where their company is in kind of the maturity cycle. So if it's really early stage, they're oftentimes thinking about, funding or how to try to find the right people for the early team, ideas on building the product and what the right technology is, or how to find their first customers, or then, as they get a little bit, better along, how they can operationalize their business. I think it really depends upon kind of where they are in their journey. If they haven't started yet, the advice I would give is, find an area that you have knowledge in, an area that you're already really knowledgeable, and just kind of go deeper into that area. I would also say, don't try to go it completely alone. Try to find a partner or partners, especially people that have complementary skill sets to you. If you're the tech guy, don't try to start a company with another tech guy. Try to find somebody who's really big into sales and marketing, because you'll be able to bring a different perspective. They'll do things that you don't want to do, and vice versa. And it helps. And it also just helps to have a partner, because it helps you just kind of stay motivated. If you're doing it all by yourself, it can be a little challenging to stay motivated.
Yeah, right on. I think that is so true in anything we do. Like, having a partner makes pretty much everything easier. Sean, I think that is a great place to wrap it up. I'll say thank you for sharing your time, sharing your perspective, and being a part of this Medical Alley community.
Hey, thanks, Frank. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed all the questions.
Wonderful. Hey, folks, thank you all for sharing your time with us and being a part of this. Make sure you register for the next one. And if you've got any questions, you need any help, track down Medical Alley starts, and we are glad to be of service. Until next time, have a great day. Bye all.